Good morning. I'm Cláudia Schwartz, welcoming you to our October 2023 UCSD HR Leadership event. By participating today, you will earn 1 hour of credit towards your PHR and SHRM certifications. You will also receive a recording of our session and a summary handout. Now, it is a pleasure to introduce our speaker, Andi Summers. Andi is the Vice President of Talent Management and Total Rewards at Palmetto. Her background includes being a Chief People Officer and consultant, starting as an HR department of one, so she can relate to all of you regardless of the size of your organization. Andi teaches the Workplace Ethics course in the UCSD HR Management Certificate Program. We're so lucky to have you sharing all that you know. And Andi is known for values-driven approach and strategic business partnerships. And I would add also for your practical wisdom that we are so fortunate to be learning from today, as Andi, you talk to us about leading through the tough stuff. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Cláudia, and thank you all for being here. I am going to start in a way that I had not initially planned to start and just say that my dear aunt passed away this morning after a long battle with Alzheimer's. And here I am showing up as a leader, both at work today and in this space and service to my community, which I know is what she would have done. And she was one of the toughest people I've ever known. And so I very much want to embody and model some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about here today and dedicate my time here today to Zola Ostergaard. Thank you, Cláudia. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I'd love to start by telling you a little about me, because as a consultant, this is what I required leaders to do. And so I try to require it of myself and practice what I preach. Down here, or up here, I should say, in the top left is my family. My husband, EJ, my daughter, Rebel. She just turned 3 in August. This picture was taken on her birthday. My husband and I have been together for 15 years. Just got married on our 10-year anniversary, celebrated our 5 years together, and he's seen me through all of it as an HR department of one, through my first executive role till now. And that partnership is just critical to who I am. Down here on the left is my best friend, Kylie. I left high school and decided I was going to be a nurse. My dear friend Kylie had cancer at the time. I was going to go and be a pediatric oncology nurse. And I am not great at math or science. I can manage a budget, don't worry, but that's pretty much the extent of my math skills. And so I decided I did not want to be a nurse, and rather I would contribute someday to the healthcare industry and to improving the world through things that I am good at. I went on to become a consultant, and one of my primary clients was Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and that felt like the peak for me. I did some of my best and most memorable work in that space and worked with some of the colleagues that are going to be part of my life for forever, and it really formed who I am as a leader. Down in the right, in the lovely hot dog on a stick uniform, that's something people on the East Coast don't appreciate. But in California, there is hot dog on a stick, and they do make you leave the hat in the locker, I can tell you. And it's a silly thing to have on this slide, perhaps, but this is where I fell in love with culture. I mean, this place is really committed, as you can see in this photo, to the culture and their desired culture that they're cultivating. And this is the first team that I ever built from the ground up on my own, running that store, developing these folks. It's what led me to the work that is now my career. And then up above them is the last team that I built in my role as Chief People Officer. This is my director team. I had a team of 10. We led HR across 6 countries globally. And gosh, it was the hardest and most formative experience of my career. So these are just some of my foundations as a person, as a professional. I graduated with my master's in human resources from Pepperdine. My background previous to that is in communications, business, nonprofit, and psychology. And now I'm at Palmetto. That's our little Palmetto P over on the right side. So let me talk to you a little bit about things that are maybe less about leadership and more about structure. Of all the things I am as a leader, I strive to be somebody who does as much as they lead. And I try really hard not to ask the people that I work with and who work for me in some instances to do things that I wouldn't do otherwise or haven't done already. I do really try to model what it is I'm asking of other folks. And it's part of the way that I lead in organizations. So before you can get into leading an organization, leading a team, leading people through really, really tough things, and I'll tell you some stories today from the last several years of my career that have been pretty tough, you got to get really clear on your objectives. Because if you don't know what you're there to accomplish, who is doing what, clarifying roles, or how you're going to work together, the tough stuff, I mean, you just can't get through it because you're not even to the starting line yet. And so it seems like the antithesis to jump into a crisis and to say, wait, before we start, what are we here to accomplish? And that's not always the right way to ask the question to get to your objectives. But at the end of the day, you need to all be really clear on what you're focused on. And we'll come back to this at the end when we talk about principles guiding the decision-making. If you all know what you're aimed towards and who is doing what in the group and when you're going to come back together, you can accomplish so much more quickly and build relationships instead of creating tension and friction in the working group, which is absolutely felt by everybody else that you're trying to lead through whatever the situation is. So just getting really clear on what the foundation is and the groundwork that you want to lay is a critical first step. And I am infamous or famous, depends maybe who you ask, for saying, what are our objectives here? Or by what criteria are we making that decision? It sounds a little scientific, and sometimes it actually helps to be really objective and take some of the personhood out of it so that you can make good decisions, because we're all coming with our own baggage, for lack of a better phrase, when we're coming to any group scenario. Okay, when you are leading through the tough stuff, I'm going to offer you, I have a handout that you can have at the end of this session. And I've got some key questions for you to ask yourself when it comes to caring for yourself. I have, you can't see it, I have a whiteboard over here that's full of index cards that some things my mother-in-law, my dear, dear mother-in-law has said to me, some things that colleagues have said to me, some things that I've seen on social media or out in the world, just written down on index cards. These key questions are something that if I'm going through something at work, I will write what I need to hear to myself down on an index card and tape it to the bottom of my computer. I've encouraged a lot of my students to do that in our ethics course, and it has seemed to be really valuable to them as well. So I wanted to offer that as a resource. And then when we move forward, we'll talk a little bit about our mindset and the lens through which we approach some of these issues. So caring for yourself, first step is self-awareness. I am a crier. It's something that I admit in groups so that people are not alarmed if I start crying. And some things at work are hard and emotional. And trust me, I'm not the only one in the room who's crying oftentimes when we're dealing with some of the crises that we deal with at this level of leadership. But knowing that about myself alleviates my own shame of being a woman, of being often the youngest person in the room, of being a leader who some people believe is supposed to have all of the answers. Just knowing about myself that that's how I move through the world means I don't need to feel shame around it. I just acknowledge it as a part of who I am, and being able to speak it out allows other people to accept that as who I am versus being concerned. And it lets people know, I know who I am. I've got this. And just so you know, you can expect this from me at some point down the future. That's one example, but self-awareness comes in so many forms. If you're not caring for yourself, you're not going to be able to effectively care for others. In fact, there's a model of psychological safety that says if you can't care for yourself, you need to step back and remove yourself from the situation, because in terms of sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the self comes first before you can pour into others, if you want to use the famous fill your cup metaphor. So that's part one. I will say.
Can I ask a question that came up? Can you give us an example of what you have written in index cards in terms of what you're telling yourself and you tape to the bottom of your computer?
Yes, I sure can. I will read you a few just off the bottom of my board. One of them says brave, gentle, and ferocious. That is from Rachel Price, who was my colleague at Knowles. The 3 W's, why am I feeling? Where did I get this message from? And whose standard am I going by? Foster Mobley of the Foster Mobley Group, that's the place that I got my start as a consultant, said that, and it really resonated with me. He also said a great leader is a definer of reality and a purveyor of hope. And that is something that really informs my style. And I think the final 2 that I'll share are, were you a leader who listened today? That is enough. Because gosh, the burden is high and heavy when you are leading a full organization. As a chief people officer, I quickly realized how lonely it feels at the top to be feeling like you are supposed to be doing something. And sometimes listening is the best thing you can do. And then finally, my mother-in-law said this to me years ago. You say that you're not built for this, but maybe you are. And so they're just really short phrases that help ground me when things get tough, because something I know about myself is that if I get in it and I can't see out of it, I'm not as effective to the people that I'm supposed to be in service to. Thank you for the question. So let me tell you about the time that I was leading as a chief people officer. It was 2021, so a period of still pretty intense social unrest in a very, very public way. I had a former employee create a blog post, very public blog post, with misinformation, with accusations, with private student information at the time. I mean, it was really not great. The president was out of town at the time. And so I worked with the acting president, who was our CFO, to come up with a plan that we presented to the executive team. And essentially we said, I think we need to shut this down because it has private student information, and that's where we draw the line, period. So we did what we could to shut it down. Simultaneously, there was a Facebook group that was not administered by the organization, but was widely joined from people of all walks of life who had worked at this organization at some point in their career. And this blog post spread like wildfire through that Facebook group. And let me tell you, you all have been on the internet and you know how people behave when you can't see them and they're just behind their keyboard and they choose to get fired up by whatever it is that they see. It doesn't matter what side of the issue they are on. And this had particular contexts around gender identity, harassment, sociopolitical stances. It was a very hot, sensitive topics. And the things people were saying about me personally in that Facebook group were so hurtful and so alarming. And it was the middle of the day. The blog post went live at like 7 p.m. the night before. We handled it into the night, just coming up with a plan to deal with it. And the next day, I found myself refreshing that page over and over because I had employees in there that I was responsible for and responsible to, and I needed to monitor and make sure things weren't getting out of control. By the time I ended that day, my husband was out of town. At the time, I had my daughter, who was about 2 years old. And my head felt like it was stuffed full of socks. I remember sitting down on the couch at the end of that first day and realizing I couldn't even think. I couldn't form sentences. I was so flooded with information and feelings and fears and not knowing how to move forward or what to do. And all of my people, my sort of advisors in my life from different parts of my career and personal life, were flabbergasted that this was happening and didn't really have great advice to offer me. And so I felt really alone. And what I realized in that moment that I've taken with me since is that I had to step away. I deleted the Facebook app off my phone and said, I'm not looking at this anymore. If something I need to be alerted to something, I had asked somebody else on the executive team to like screen things and let me know if they came up so that I could handle them, but that I wasn't going to subject myself to that anymore because I couldn't be effective. How was I going to write a school-wide communication that was unbiased when I felt hurt as a human, that was what the school needed to hear, when I couldn't think clearly? And so just knowing that I needed to shut down for the night, tell my team I'm offline, I need to be offline unless it's emergent, wake up early in the morning, block time, put my priorities in order, and get really tactical, define our objectives, get the right people in the room, agree to how we were going to manage this and the if and then statements. And all of that allowed me to move through it in a way that in those first 36 hours, I was just rendered incapable. But if I hadn't had the awareness to sit down and realize that I had to take a step back, my self-care would have gone out the window. I would not have made good decisions. The school would have seen me as harried as I felt. And one of the things I learned as a consultant is that you got to be like a duck in water. Nobody should see how fast you're swimming beneath the surface. And while I'll break that in a slide, sometimes that's just not true and you need to show up authentically. For the most part, as a leader, my job is to provide stability, to be a definer of reality and a purveyor of hope. And I can't do that if I'm muddled in my own stuff. So that self-awareness is really, really, really key in how you move through things. Lead yourself so you can lead others, so that others can lead others, because you can't lead everyone.
Wow. Incredible practical wisdom. And Andi, you don't have to name your former employer, but when you say school, it wasn't a regular school. Maybe you can help those that are not familiar with your past employer. What kind of school was it?
An outdoor leadership school. Yeah, so outdoor education, but we had students anywhere from ages 12 to 70. I mean, we call them all students, but we took great care when I was there of our students. And that was our first priority. That was our North Star. And so that's what we agreed to and how we made our decisions.
Yeah, because it even raises the bar for you because it was a leadership school.
Absolutely. And that's something we talked about a lot, is what would we be expecting our students to do in the field or in the classroom in a given situation? Boundaries. I told people to leave me be, please, that night when I realized that my head was full of socks. And I have grown to be pretty unabashed about my boundaries because I know that I am doing it not to be selfish, not because somebody else's needs are less important than mine, but I want to show up at my best so that I can be there in whatever function you need me to be there in. And I can't do that if I'm working late every night, if I am saying yes to everything. And so I think realizing the self-awareness, what you need, and asking for it are two really different things and two really different skills. And it can be really difficult to ask for what you need and to, instead of saying, I'm sorry and apologizing for your need, thanking people for respecting it and stating your intention so that it doesn't have to seem like you're selfish. You can say, I want to be a team player and I've been working for 14 hours. I've got to shut down so I can come back. And if you need me, here's how you can get a hold of me. So those boundaries are related and really critical. Any questions, Cláudia, or can I tell a short story about that?
Please tell your story.
Okay. So we used an employee net promoter score, ENPS, as one measure of engagement at Knowles, National Outdoor Leadership School. It's a great tool. I'm doing that again here at Palmetto in a bigger context, but an ENPS is a wonderful metric if you can get your hands on it. And we didn't want just a number for that quantitative measure. We also wanted the qualitative data. So we had an open feedback box, essentially, of answer the question, would you recommend this as a great place to work on a scale of 1 to 10? Leave your feedback as to why you answered that. And boy, howdy, are people honest when you give them an anonymous forum. Some of that feedback can be very discouraging as an organizational leader. And anybody who has sat in a seat of reading people's engagement survey data knows that there's always those 1 or 2 or 8 or 12 people somewhere in the mix who are really unhappy. And so I realized that if I was going to be the one reading this data, and our team was small at the time, and as I said before, I do the work that I ask other people to do with me and for me. And so I was reading this data to come up with themes, and I realized I needed to, one, chunk it out. So I wasn't just pouring through hundreds of comments, some of them positive, don't get me wrong, and we certainly saw huge leaps and bounds of improvement, but plenty of not even constructive, but downright negative comments. And it was making it difficult for me. I found myself feeling defensive. I was sitting on a flight home from Wyoming to Pennsylvania, and I realized that I wanted to argue with the people in the comments, and that was not a productive mindset for me to be in. And so I needed to step back, delegate part of it out, and say, you take this third, you take this third, I'll take this third. And we split the comments that related to our team amongst all of us. So it wasn't just one of us that felt like we were getting beat up for all the good work we were trying so hard to do, and change takes time. So of course, people don't see it right away or feel it right away. And that can be really difficult. And so setting the boundary around, I can't do this on my own, and asking for help made it better in the long run, because we had multiple perspectives instead of just mine. We were able to report out on the data more quickly, and all of us got to sort of share in some of that misery, dare I say, and have a little comedic relief, or have a little bit of camaraderie, because it wasn't just one of us sort of drowning in all of that feedback. So it can be a tactical piece of advice too, setting those boundaries.
And how about the development aspect for your team by involving them?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the really great benefits of having a lean team, is it can be tough to arrange roles and responsibilities among who's doing what and why, et cetera, and managing workload. But the fact that everybody gets to try a little something is a real benefit. And I started my career after grad school in learning and development, and I did a lot of that while I was consulting. And so that all of my teams know, if they're working with me, they're going to learn, if nothing else.
Yeah. Sometimes I think it's how many of you out there can relate to this, right? And in my earlier career, I also made that kind of mistake with good intentions. Like, this is so bad, I better handle this myself. It's too painful, so okay, I will take this. But really, we're depriving others from growing through that experience.
Yep, absolutely. Even shielding leadership teams from the data that they need to see. There are some times where I've seen teams, including my own team, say, I don't know if we really want to share these open comments with the executive team. These are pretty brash. And to the contrary, I said, this is a real opportunity for them to understand what it means when they say they don't trust the executive team. They don't get it. So let's help them get it. And let's give them a heads up that it might hurt a little bit when you're first reading the data, and processing that is okay. That's a learned skill as well.
Yeah. And the question is, what kind of relationship had you established with them prior to the moment when you had to bring the tough news?
Absolutely. Yep. And setting expectations, setting and managing expectations, I think, is the greatest tool in the stakeholder management toolbox. Help people know what they can expect from you, if it's going to be good, if it's going to be hard, if it's going to take them an hour, if it's going to take them 8 hours. Help them understand what's expected of them. And that brings people into a space where they don't have to feel uncertain about the container, and they can really just focus on what it is that you're bringing them into. So final piece here is having a future focus. It is sometimes difficult. It is often difficult to be in a very hard situation and to think, Is this going to matter in 6 weeks? Maybe it might matter in 6 weeks. Is it going to matter in 6 months? If it's not going to matter in 6 months, if it's not the thing people are going to be talking about in 6 months, chances are it's heavier to you than it is to anybody else. And that's okay. It's good to take your work seriously, and it's better to not take yourself so seriously. But if you can put it in perspective of, this is a really hard thing and I can get through this, and there's something good on the other side of this, that can go a long way in helping you get through something whole, rather than having to just struggle through it. It can be really valuable to think, what's something I can learn from this? Is there something to be learned from this? And I'd argue there's always something to be learned, even if it's a lesson you might like to otherwise avoid. There's 2 words, serendipity and zemblanity, Zemblanity. And zemblanity is like the opposite of serendipity, where you're learning something from a really, really hard experience, but it was meant to happen and you were meant to learn it. And I think it's just a fantastic word and really typifies a lot of the experiences I've had. There's not going to be good in every single moment, but good will come from the hard things that we do together, and doing hard things and overcoming adversity together is one of the best ways to build team. A story about this is I implemented ADP as Chief People Officer. We had never had a fully integrated HRIS, Human Resources Information System. Not that I need to tell most people here that. And it was a struggle. I mean, gosh, it was really hard. We had new leadership in HR, new leadership in finance. We had people who'd been doing things the way they'd been doing them for 30 years, and other people who had been at a new organization 6 months ago came in and said, what do you mean you do payroll like this? That doesn't make any sense. And implementing an HRIS in a perfect situation is really difficult. And so it was tough, and it was good. It was really, really good. And we were all very committed, huge cross-functional effort. It was very cool to see it come together. And it did come together. But 3 days before we were supposed to go live, we'd been communicating, people knew it was coming. 3 days before people were starting to enter their time in ADP, we were shutting our old system down to archive it. ADP said, oh, sorry, we just realized that there's this thing you should know about. And essentially, because of the way that you do things here and based on your policies, et cetera, we're going to have to do a variance letter for every single individual employee during tax season next year if we go live right now. And our whole team was, I totally cried. I came right out of that meeting and I had to go into an executive team meeting. And I took a second before that and called my colleague and said, can you believe this? We've been working on this for 6 months and 72 hours, 3 days before we go live. Now they're telling us this. There's no way it didn't come up before now. And we went into that executive team meeting, she and I, and had to tell the E-team that we were not going to go live because that was going to be a poor experience for our employees. And one of our whole purposes of doing this, to go back to objectives, was to provide a good user experience to our employees, because that had never been done well before. So because we had all aligned on those objectives, it made the decision to not go live really easy. But coming out to the school, telling them that one of my key priorities for the last 12 months was not going to go live, like we had been cheering about for 3-4 months, was not my favorite moment of my career. Let me tell you, it was really unpleasant to look forward to that community forum and know what I had to tell people. And yet, the number of emails, and I still feel surprised by this, the number of emails I got from people who were not involved in the process, like not anybody in the working group deeper in the organization, saying, oof, that had to be so tough. I'm so sorry you had to make this decision. I can't wait to see what this looks like in January. I get goosebumps just thinking about it. It was not the reaction that I had expected at all. And it was such an affirmation of how great of a job we had done around communication and change management, that we got all the way to this point and said, oh, wait, we can't go live yet. And everybody said, it's all right. Sorry that happened. That sucks. And just went along with it. And then we had a really wonderful go live in January, and everything went off without a hitch because we took the time to get it right. And so it just goes to show you, have that future focus. Maybe it was only a 3-month or a 1-quarter difference, but for the working team, it was so discouraging because, of course, they had been doing fire drills, getting ready for this thing. And for the organization, all they saw was the good that we had painted on the horizon. And so we kept moving towards that horizon, and it really, really served us.
Just as a quick side, how did you communicate the news without throwing anybody else under the bus?
Well, I think in general, one of my principles for communicating something that I might otherwise like to not be saying is, instead of saying what we're not doing, saying what we are doing. Because you can say the same thing, but with a positive frame on it, if you will. So what we said is, we're really committed to your experience. We just learned that if we go live in 3 days, 2 days at the time, your experience is not going to be positive, and we're not willing to accept that. So instead of going live on the 17th of October, we're going to go live on January 1st. Thank you so much for your understanding. Thanks for being on the ride with us. Let us know if you have any questions. And then we talked about it in a community forum where everybody had the opportunity to be present. Yeah, worked well, thankfully. So that's a little bit about ourselves, and I'm going to move to how we care for others and the organizations that we serve. I am going to tell you a couple of stories that are very dear to my heart over the next couple of slides. The first is to remember that we are all people first, period. Before you are anything, before you are a husband, a wife, a partner, a friend, a daughter, a son, a mother, a father, anything, before you are anything, you are a human being. We are a species on this earth. There's a taxonomy. We are people, and there are ways that people work. There are a lot of things that we all have in common. That's why beautiful models like the Maslow's hierarchy feel so applicable, because we can all relate to it, even if it looks different for all of us. It is really easy in a situation like with the blog post that I was telling you about, or like the story I'm going to tell you in a second, to want to blame others. Why are you doing this? If you would just understand, you don't have all the information. It is so much simpler and human nature to finger point and take that pain and discomfort out of our realm and say, it's not about me, it's about somebody else. And if instead you can turn to empathy and remember that we are all people first, and we are all generally doing the very best with what we have available to us, it will go a long way in soothing you in that situation, and in how you treat other people and how you encourage others to treat them. Because this doesn't just apply to you and your own perception of a situation, but when you're sitting in a room with a team, take the payroll team who doesn't sit in finance, looking at the accounting team and saying, if they would just approve it faster, if they would just pay attention to that tracker that I sent them, if they would just ask questions 3 days ago instead of on payroll cutoff, we wouldn't be in this situation. And it seems really simple, but things like that, those little pinches, can turn into a crunch pretty quickly and create friction that impacts the way that we're interacting. And then we're in a vicious cycle of not being nice to each other, not getting things done as well as they could get done. And it impacts the business ultimately. If instead you're in that room and you say, I hear that you sound really frustrated, and I get it. It's human to be frustrated. And do you really think this is their intention? Do you really think, like, we have a shared objective to get payroll done and out the door accurately? Do you really think they don't want that the same way you do? Clearly, there is something amiss here, and we need to address it. And they're not doing this to upset you. And so let's get through it. Let's have a clearing conversation, and let's have a request for change. But let's not blame and finger point. So at the same time as I was dealing with that blog post, about not quite 30 days later, somebody on the other side of this socio-political spectrum had an issue. We had a walkout and a petition that was very widely circulated. And somebody knew somebody who knew an influencer on social media and convinced this influencer to post about the situation that was occurring at work in a very public way. And oh boy, it was painful. The post was inflammatory, but not derogatory. Thankfully, I'll take wins where I can get them. But it's a really sensitive situation, especially when it feels, and we talk a lot about this in my ethics course, like your own personal code or character or morality is being questioned, especially in a really public setting, but just in general, that automatically puts humans on the defense. You're assuming that you know what I think, feel, believe. Oh, no, no, no. You do not get to assume that about me. And you automatically go into that defensive position, which makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary standpoint and doesn't help you move through that. Trust me. And gosh, I was really fired up about this thing. It was a mess. It was a mess in every single way that HR could ever imagine. It was a mess. And it was very public. And it continued to be very, very public. And everybody in this room will appreciate that HR doesn't always get to tell its side of the story. Oftentimes, we don't get to tell our side of the story. And so sitting there and letting people believe whatever they're going to believe can be really darn difficult. And I was pretty bitter for some time, truly, because it put our organization through a lot that it didn't need to go through at a really, really sensitive time. And it didn't have to go the way that it went. And so I felt angry, I felt wronged, and I felt out of control of the situation because I was out of control. It wasn't me that was doing it. And so realizing that this person, this influencer, they had their own agenda, and this fit perfectly into their content calendar. Like, this was squarely right in their sweet spot. If I was them and I believed what I was being told, I probably would have done the same thing that they did, because they were advocating for what they believed was right. And that's their whole platform. And once I was able to step back and recognize that they thought they were doing what was right for their community, for their platform, for their own ego, I don't know the person that well, it helped bring me back to their humanity. They weren't doing this necessarily. They don't care about me. It could have been anybody, right? I felt wronged because I felt wronged, and I'm human and I get to feel my feelings, but it wasn't about me. And so being able to come back to that helped to really de-escalate the tone in all of our communication around this topic, because it was a hot topic within the organization. Helped to de-escalate our conversations with the person themselves, because we could start from a place of understanding and then tackle it a little bit more factually rather than being on the defensive. And it really, really served us in moving past this eventually. And it took some time, but we're able to get through it. And so I would just invite you to believe that everybody is doing their best with what they've got, even if it's not benefiting you. We are all the hero of our own story. This next point is something that they say at my husband's company, actually, which I love that they say this, and that's to pursue clarity over certainty. I said earlier that some people believe leaders need to have all the answers. And part of that is because as humans, we don't like uncertainty. We don't like the discomfort of not knowing. And sometimes the very best thing you can do is say, I don't know. This is not novel. This is not new. Every person on LinkedIn has made a post about coming out, being brave, and saying that you don't know the answer. And when you're in that situation, it's super uncomfortable to sit at the top of an organization and say, I don't know. It's super uncomfortable in my role now to sit in a Q&A session about benefits and say, I don't know. I'm going to have to talk to somebody else on my team and get back to you on that. I'm not our benefits expert. And she absolutely is. And I don't want to give you misinformation. But it is vulnerable to say that you don't know, because in our society, we're so often judged on our competence. And it feels intuitively like you're admitting that you're not competent by saying that you don't know something, when in reality, pursuing clarity and getting in the right direction over the certainty of knowing, that is how you get through tough things. Because in the tough stuff, nobody really knows, not right away anyways. And if you pursue clarity together, you can get there. Time and time again, I've seen it happen over and over and over in the hardest situations, that we all decide we don't know, but we're going to figure it out together. Changes the whole dynamic versus having one person in the room who says they know. And now we're all trying to convince that person, or they're trying to convince us, and it's not collaborative and it's not productive. I was in a position to redesign a very controversial training. And I was working with the person who had invented the training, essentially. They had designed the whole thing. It had been sort of their baby, their project. When they were at a pretty junior level, they had grown to be in a more senior position. And so people feel protective over the things they create. And I know what that feels like. I felt that way about things that I've created in the past. And so I could start with humanity, and I had a job to do. And it was my job to get this training to a certain place. And I knew where the hot buttons were. But again, it was linked to values and morals and organizational stance. And in the environment that we're operating in these days, it's just especially tricky to navigate those conversations and maintain the relationship at the same time. And so I remember having a conversation with the person who designed the training, and we had gone back and forth for weeks. We had a timeline. It was like 6 weeks. We were about 4 weeks into the 6, and we could not come into agreement, let alone alignment. And I eventually said to her, it feels like we are in, like, I don't like putting you in a corner and me having to be the one cornering you and telling you that it can't be this way. I don't like the way this dynamic has shaken out, and I want to fix it, and I don't know how. And so coming out and admitting to her that something was happening, we were both contributing to it. One of my favorite phrases is, how are you contributing to the very thing you're complaining about? Sometimes it takes me a minute to get there, but it's really helpful once I do. And she said, you know what? I think what we forgot is that we're in this corner together. And that is something I have carried with me, that sometimes the best you can do is know what you don't know and try to get there in partnership. And that leads me to my last point, is to prioritize partnership. I'm a big fan of pithy email signatures. I have my go-tos: kindly, warmly. And then I have, best, whatever it is. We all have cheers. I don't use cheers, but I work with a lot of people who do. I also have 2 that I use more sparingly, but very intentionally. One is in service, and the other is in partnership. Because I really find that if you can frame the work that you are doing as wanting to be in partnership, it really changes the tone of the communication. It changes the tone of the objectives, and it allows you to get to a better solution, because you're opening the door to not needing to be the one who's right or the one who's in charge or any of that. It sort of takes ego out the door and says, hey, we've got this problem. We need to solve it together. What do you think we should do? When I was hired as a consultant, one of the most pivotal people in my career called me partner from the start. She was more senior to me. She was the person I wanted to be when I grew up. I was totally enthralled with her, still am. I think she's incredible. And I often think, what would Shayna do in this situation? And she called me partner from the start. I was a coordinator when I got hired. She was a senior consultant. I mean, we were not really partners in terms of hierarchy, but the way she treated me embodied that. Totally embodied partnership. And now it's just a mindset I carry everywhere with me, is how could we be partners in this? Few things are ever done well alone, truly. You might get to be the star of it. You might get to say that you did it. But as everybody else on LinkedIn has written, real leaders highlight the team beneath them and not themselves when something goes right. And when something goes wrong, it's often the leader who wears it. What I tell my teams is, if the piano falls, I want it to fall on my head, not yours. And given that, here's how we're going to make the decision. We're going to come into alignment, but I'm going to own it because it's mine to own. And that alleviates the pressure on my team for all kinds of situations, but especially really tough ones that they feel really sensitive to or that feel really visible in the organization or to leadership, is owning that as a leader. And that means that I can be in partnership with my team. It doesn't need to be hierarchical in structure. It's just a different way of thinking about it. There's a situation that I use in my ethics class. It's their very first quiz, and we talk about a visa program. I was a responsible officer for a global visa program for the US in my last role as a chief people officer. Fascinating. I mean, very fascinating area of our work, working in visas, and tough. It's very technical and it's very high stress because you're answering to the federal government at the end of the day. People's careers, people's lives, people's livelihoods in their home country and in the US are really dependent on you doing it well and doing it right. And that requires a detail of accuracy that can be really uncomfortable sometimes, because not a lot of work in HR outside of payroll requires that much precision and benefits, things like that. But visas require a lot of precision, and there's a lot of compliance involved. I took over a visa program that had been in place since 1964 and had never been audited for compliance. Scary thing, to turn over all those rocks and see what might lie beneath. So we found some things, and nothing had ever happened. There was no reason, there was no red flag, if you will, that made me want to do an audit. It's just part of my leadership style. That's why I teach ethics here, is that I like to be in compliance with things that I'm responsible for. So I started turning over the rocks and realizing we needed to make some changes. Nothing that was going to negatively impact anybody in the immediate, but that did put the business at risk for losing about $7 million of revenue in their height of the season in the next year if we made the changes that I was recommending. And that is a scary thing for any business to be facing, to know that you have to make a change just for the sake of compliance, and you're putting profitability on the line in order to do it without a good solution in place of that. And so I came around with my directors of operations, who were really the SMEs in the spaces where we were using visas. So while I managed the program, they were the ones who needed it to work. And so we, the three of us, came together and said, here's what we have to fix. Here's the things we can't do anymore. And here's the couple of things we need to start doing. All of that aside, let's come up with some creative options. So we took all, and there's a lot of US visas. I don't know if you've looked at the list. There's a lot of them. We took all of the visas, looked at the requirements, looked at the purposes of each visa, compared it to our business objectives, and we had to move fast because we were out of compliance essentially, and the end of the quarter was coming. And we came up with the most elegant solution to this problem. We did not forfeit any of our revenue, thankfully, and we were able to start using new visas that opened up career paths for our global employee population that we had never had access to before. It was a really, really cool thing. So we were able to bring people in, skill them up, and then send them back home to upskill their campus, and then do the same thing over again. It improved our retention. It improved people's engagement. It was astounding. So we went from being absolutely terrified, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? This is a mess, to full of pride of this thing that we now got to do for the organization, for our employees. It was a real game changer. And it would have been very different if I was the HR police coming into the room saying, no, 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 you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And sometimes that's the position that it feels like we can be in. And if we can change our lens to being in partnership, it can really make a difference. In the interest of time, I'm going to breeze through my next slide, and then we can end on a Q&A, Cláudia. Okay. Oh. Allow me to tell you about Jack. In July of 2022, I was working for Knowles, the National Outdoor Leadership School, and we had a student in the field who was struck by lightning and killed. I got the call at about 8:30 that night before we knew much of anything. And when students are in the field, we had not had a fatality in 10 years. And when students are in the field, if they are really in the field, the only way you can get a hold of them is with a satellite phone or sending a helicopter out to find them. It was a really bad storm. Search and rescue couldn't land right away. So most of my colleagues were in Wyoming because that had been the model early on. We had a lot of people with a lot of tenure who were still there at the headquarters, and I was in Pennsylvania. And I sat on Zoom with everybody else in that room in Wyoming until 6 o'clock in the morning. So almost 12 straight hours trying to figure out everything. I mean, absolutely everything. There are things in a crisis like that that you cannot imagine that came up. Apart from that student, how are we going to support the instructors who were there and trying to provide life-saving services? How were we going to support the other students? How were we going to get them out of the field? What were we going to do when they got back? What about the parents? What about our other employees? Are other instructors going to want to go into the field? How soon do we tell everyone? We need to get a press release together. Where's search and rescue? Can we get in touch with a psychologist to provide care? And Knowles is the leader in wilderness risk management. I mean, when these things happen, if I were in the field and something happened to me, I'd hope that I was with somebody from Knowles. We have protocols around this. We had attended a training. I remember we used a bear attack that had occurred several years ago as the example in our training. And I remember sitting in that training thinking, gosh, I hope I never have to use this. And I probably won't. I won't be here my whole career and nothing's happened in 10 years. And then Jack happened. And it was the most difficult experience of my entire career and the most meaningful experience I've ever had in a work setting. And that's where I came up with these principles. Pacing. How soon can you do things? How quickly can you do things? When do you wait? When do you just go? If you can't make the decision, do you say you can't make the decision? Who goes first? All of the sequencing that happens in those scenarios. When things get really tough, it's important to slow down and think about other people's experience of this, because you are in it, and it is easy to forget that you are in it and other people are not. You are processing, you are managing it, and other people are going to be hearing about this for the first time. And so pacing that can really help manage people's experience if you're thinking about the sequence of communication and what you share when. Empathy. My teams know that I talk a lot about how love needs a seat at the table at work. This goes back to remembering that people are people and caring for yourself so you can care for others. It is all from a place of care. And I would encourage you to prioritize empathy above all else when the going gets tough, whether it is an HRIS implementation gone wrong or a social media firestorm or a fatality in the field. Being empathetic towards yourself towards the people involved, towards the people that you don't even realize are going to be impacted. Assuming that everyone will be impacted leaves you in a place of leading from the heart. And then finally, direction and principles. You don't always know what to do in that situation. Most nobody in the room knows exactly what to do. But if you know the direction you're headed, you know that students come first, parents come second, everybody else comes third. If you know that we have protocol, I mean, figure out what your principles are and talk about them. And then you can make decisions quicker, and you're making the best decision possible in the moment, knowing that you might not always make the right one. So this gets a little bit back to objectives, as I said that it would, but knowing what your North Star is when the going gets tough is sometimes the only thing that gets you through it. And I feel really proud of how we handled that, and it doesn't make it any less difficult. Oh, and that's all I've got are a few stories of some tough things that I've led through in the last 4 years, and hopefully some lessons that you can take away with you to your next role, to your current team, to the next tough thing that you're leading through. Because gosh, we're all leading through tough stuff all the time right now.
Andi, we are so lucky to learn from your well-grounded inspiration.
Thank you, Cláudia. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate the time.
Talk about practical wisdom. You are a master. So if anyone has one question, we have a couple of minutes to go. And while we look for additional questions, how much of your effectiveness do you attribute to how you manage yourself versus looking for an organization where you can be effective?
I think that's a really good question. I think it is about managing yourself and knowing yourself and making sure that you can be in alignment with whatever the organization is committed to. Because if you're finding that your own values are not aligned with that of the organization that you're working for, I think it's really difficult to show up in the way that you need to show up. Not impossible, but it certainly makes it difficult because there's a natural dissonance. So I think knowing yourself and managing yourself absolutely helps you be grounded, but being in the right place really matters.
Yeah. And so how do we go about assessing the true values of the leadership and the organization? So you just selected a new partner organization 4 months ago. How do you really know?
Yeah, well, I'd say look at the values on their website, but espoused values only go so far. It doesn't really speak to their lived values. So I think talking to people who work there, talking to people who used to work there can be really helpful. I think asking very directly about the things that matter to you. A couple of questions that I always ask when I'm exploring a new opportunity are, can you tell me about the last time, when I'm talking to an executive team, can you tell me about the last time that you made a tough decision? How did you make it? And what do you wish you had done differently? Really helps me understand their decision-making process, which I know is important to me. So I think asking, knowing what you care about and asking very directly about it is key.
Exactly. And the kind of leaders you want to work with appreciate those questions.
For sure. Yes, that no data is data, right? So if they don't want to answer that question, that is sometimes your answer itself. I see a question about the ADP launch in here that I'm happy to answer. With all the background cheer and anticipation, how did I show up personally? Well, after the utter shock of hearing the news that we were not going to be able to go live, and I recovered from that, I went into a place with my executive team where I could be vulnerable. And so I came right out of that E-team meeting and or ADP meeting into E-team, and I was pretty upset. And that was okay in that space. But when I showed up to the organization, I was steadfast. It just was what it was. And I was genuinely really committed to making sure that they had a good experience on the other side of it. I think it really helps to believe what you're saying whenever you can. And I really believed it. I don't know that I examined the science behind changing my mind and persuading others to change it but there was only so much I could do. So I committed to being transparent and telling them maybe what they didn't want to hear. I didn't want to hear it, right? I don't blame them. But embracing the joy of being wrong, I didn't really embrace it until I got so many emails from people who said, oh, that sucks. That must be so tough. Oh, I'm sorry that happened. Hey, thanks for telling us. Can't wait to see it in January. Now I can embrace the joy of being wrong, because that's a lesson that I learned during that experience, is that it's okay. And sometimes it works out for the best. So thank you for the question. And I don't know that I was doing those things in the moment, but it sure taught me the value of those things in the long run.
Yes. Andi, what we learned from you will stay with us for countless years. And thank you so much for offering us that handout, highlighting the key bits of wisdom. So if you're participating today, you will be getting that handout in the recording link later today. And so thank you so much, Andi. It was just outstanding. We're grateful to you.
Thank you so much, Cláudia. And thank you for your feedback. And thank you, Judy, in the comments. I really appreciate it. I'm so happy to be here. Take care of yourselves and take care of others.
Thank you. And we hope everyone joins us for the November 9th program that will be on compensation trends and practices for 2024.